In 1983, Pontiac dropped the Fiero on the US, a classic 80s car that never really lived up to its potential over 5 troublesome years. But it became a cult favorite and an indelible part of car culture. And it's just another, perhaps the best example of GM finally getting a car right, only to kill it off. This is a far too brief history of the Pontiac Fiero. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John. The Fiero left a mark on the 80s and for a brief time was extremely popular. Its history will forever be entwined with the Toyota MR2 that came out the next year. And interestingly, both cars have a similar backstory. The primary difference being that Toyota put their resources into the MR2 while the designers of the Fiero had to mislead and not quite lie to get their project off the ground and funded. In the late 1970s, Pontiac was filled with large cars choked by emissions regulations, facing increasing gas mileage standards, and also increasingly not that difficult from other GM brands. The excitement division had lost a lot of its excitement. In 1978, Pontiac's advanced engineering group was led by Turkish-born Hulki Aldikatkai. I'm sorry I pronounced that incorrectly, please forgive me. And he proposed a plastic-bodied mid-engine sports car. General Manager Bob Stempel liked the idea, but he knew that when GM Corporate heard about it, they would never approve it. What would be a less expensive version of the Corvette. They didn't want the competition. Chief Engineer Robert Dorn proposed that the car could be sold as a cheap 2-seat commuter car with up to 50 miles per gallon. It worked, and this project was designated the P car, but was only given a budget of $410 million, which was to include the plant retooling. Consider that the Corsica and the Beretta were a $1.8 billion project. Now, Hulki was put in charge of this as the project manager and the chief engineer, and with a tepid go-ahead, he was careful to try to keep the project kind of out of the limelight and away from the prying eyes of upper management. Most of the engineering was actually done by an outside firm called Engineering Technology Limited, ENTEC, from Troy, Michigan. With such a tight budget, Hulki knew he had to raid GM's parts bin. While the unibody frame was new, the engineers realized they could take the McPherson strut front suspension and the transaxle from the newly designed X cars, rotate them 180 degrees, and create the rear of the car. The front suspension and the steering was taken from the subcompact Chevette and was non-power assisted and was never power assisted during production. While the initial dream was of a high-revving V6, the promises of high fuel economy they made and the lack of a suitable engine led to the team grabbing the 2.5-liter Iron Duke 4-cylinder. This is a slow-revving, noisy, heavy pushrod 4 that's exactly the opposite of what you want in a sporty car, but it was cheap and affordable, and if they tried to design the V6 from scratch, it would have cost more than the entire project for the Fiero. To make the Iron Duke work, the radiator was located at the front of the car with very long coolant lines that were built into the wide sills, and the oil pan was made more shallow to fit in the back of the car, meaning that the engine only took about 3 quarts of oil. Finally, at the time, GM didn't have a 5-speed manual, so the team had to grab the 4-speed manual and the 3-speed automatic from the X cars as well. As expected, the design changed during development. Initially, they wanted a large glass area over the engine, but that was deemed too expensive and too heavy. In 1980, the normal process would have been to present the engineering and a full-size clay model to management, but Hulki knew that if the project was still so tenuous, he ordered ENTEC to build a drivable prototype. Give the committee something to actually drive and see. And it worked, and the senior management signed off and gave production approval. The approved design was transferred to Pontiac 2 Studios, headed by Jack Shanella, to make production ready. Design changes were made, including raking the windshield even more and pushing the cab forward to really accentuate the wedge design. Regardless, the design team was not out of the woods yet. GM had a horrible year in 1980, and in the fall, Hulke was ordered to stop work. He chose to ignore the order, as well as 2 subsequent ones telling him to stop. Stemple had moved up the ladder, and the new Pontiac general manager was Bill Haugland, and in October 1980, he worked to keep the project going, although the budget had to shrink even more. Haugland was a fan and recognized the promised 50 miles per gallon was unrealistic, and also recognized the P car as a sports car, not only keeping the project going, but authorizing the development of a V6 package. He did this primarily by convincing management that the car would sell 100,000 units a year, a promise that would come back to haunt them. For the plastic panels, the team achieved several breakthroughs, not only in painting the panels, but in the design and the manufacturing. The platform was designed with mounting points, and the engineers devised a process where a machine would lower 39 different milling heads at once, mill a spot, and then drill the hole. The result was body panel tolerances of approximately 1/2 millimeter. Worth noting is there's actually 4 different types of plastic used on the car. Hulke also leaned heavily into the team concept used at plants such as those run by Toyota, with manufacturing working in teams and putting an emphasis on quality and a trust between labor and management, and getting everyone to buy into the project. To keep costs further under control, they grabbed an unused factory at GM's Pontiac, Michigan complex. But what to name the car? Multiple names were suggested, such as the P3000, Pegasus, Sunfire, and the Firebird XP. Pegasus was an early favorite. In fact, the logo for the car was created before the advertising people said no, because they thought buyers would have too much trouble pronouncing it. With the team concept, Haugland allowed the hourly workers to name the car, and Fiero was the winner, meaning fierce or proud in Italian. When the car was released in 1983 as an 84 model, it reflected the various and competing ideas and compromises that had to be made to make it to fruition. The Iron Duke engine produced just 92 horsepower. The car initially was intended to be around 2,000 pounds, but ended up over 2,400. The steering was non-assisted and heavy, and the attractive concept interior had been replaced with what amounts to typical 80s GM. Contemporary reviews, such as from Car and Driver, described it as a cumbersome car with a stiff ride, darty steering, the brakes locked up unpredictably, and the 0 to 60 times were tested to be in the 11+ second range. However, with a base price of $7,999, it cost as little as a Plymouth Horizon or a VW Rabbit, and the higher line SE trim model at $95.99 was comparable to a Honda Prelude. Those acceleration numbers weren't great, but they were in the range of other modest coupes at the time. And the car was a hit. It went on to sell over 136,000 units its first year. Oh, and they actually did hit that 50 mile per gallon EPA mileage goal on the highway in the most fuel efficient version. In 1985, the V6 debuted with a 2.8 liter rated at 140 horsepower, taking away much of the criticism the first model year endured. It came with a 4-speed manual, and the Iron Duke was tweaked for 2 more horsepower and was now available with an Isuzu 5-speed manual. In 1986, the fastback model arrived with the rear windows looking onto the engine cover, not inside the car. A 5-speed transaxle became the standard for the V6 now, and cosmetic tweaks migrated down the various trim lines. For 1987, the 4-cylinder power increased to 98 horsepower with other major modifications. For this year, there was a dealership-offered option that changed the body to one resembling a Ferrari 308, and it was called the Fiero Mera. It was considered a separate model, only 247 were produced, and production was halted when Ferrari became grumpy and sued about it. For its last year in 1988, there was a new suspension that is what engineers wanted to use all along. They had staggered wheel sizes on some models, new vented disc brakes, improved steering, and further improvements to both engines. and this was the only year a yellow factory paint was offered. Unfortunately, the Fiero was a victim of many issues working against it. As mentioned earlier, the promise of 100,000 units a year was a pipe dream, and after that first year of strong sales, well, sales pretty consistently shrunk. The new general manager of Pontiac was a hardcore finance guy who was charged with getting the numbers back on track. And while the upper levels of the Fiero were profitable, they ended up figuring out that they were losing about $2,000 per car. Further, and perhaps most importantly, the car had many issues through its lifetime. Remember I said they decreased the size of the oil pan? Well, the Iron Duke tended to run hot, and it had a connecting rod issue that they were very slow to address. The supplier actually estimated that somewhere between 60 and 90% of the connecting rods they supplied were fine, but that meant 1 or 4 out of every 10 they provided were perhaps faulty. The engine also had a tendency to leak oil, and if an oil leak hits hot exhaust, the car caught on fire. If the oil ran a little low or ran too hot, the connecting rod would break and spray oil everywhere, and the car caught on fire. The fire issue was known all the way back in '83 when 2 Fieros caught fire during testing. And by 1987, it was determined that they were catching fire at a rate of 1 out of every 508 cars sold. GM unfortunately tried to blame owners for not doing proper maintenance and leading to the connecting rod failures, but eventually they quietly began making improvements under warranty, sometimes apparently paying off owners to keep them quiet. But the reports of fires got the NHTSA's attention, and they opened an investigation. And the car now had a reputation, and an exciting sports car that sold poorly and was becoming an embarrassment to the company also was now 5 years old and in need of a redesign. The writing was on the wall. In July 2003, a prototype of the 1990 Fiero was displayed and currently sits at the GM Heritage Center. It shows a heavy Firebird influence and, excitingly, was planned to have the 190 horsepower Quad 4 to replace the Iron Duke, and a new V6 with over 200 horsepower, which was eventually the one used in the Grand Prix in the Lumina Z34. One reason given for its cancellation was also an expected downturn in sports car sales. With a general economic doldrum in the 90s and other sports cars such as the CRX being canceled, it does seem that GM was right on track with predicting the future and the slowdown in sports car sales. I love the Fiero, especially the exterior styling, and I've always wanted one. It's now considered a collectible and eminently customizable, both with replacing those plastic body panels as well as swapping in other engines from that Quad 4 to being able to fit a North Star V8. Unfortunately, I can't fault GM for canceling it and not investing in another generation. They were spot on with their analysis for where the market would actually go, and the early versions of the car were GM being penny wise and pound foolish, putting out a parts bin special that should have been, well, special. But the Fiero's legacy lived on in other ways. It did its job of helping rebuild Pontiac into the excitement division. Their experience with the new teamwork in a plant, as well as the use of space frame body and plastic panels, lived on famously not only in the Saturn product, but other products from General Motors, such as their minivans. It's a cult favorite. I miss it. I would have loved to have seen GM put the resources to make this a winner and keep it going for other generations, but with such a low volume car, they did have a lot of other things on their plate at the time that they needed to focus on. And so the Fiero lives on as a brief glimpse, a snapshot of 80s GM. Thanks for watching.